Can you hear me? Yeah. So welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to introduce you Professor Jean Ouinan, who is a professor of Egyptology at the University of Liège. During his career, he received a number of prizes. He's also UNESCO chairs holder. Professor Ouinan is here in Torino as a visiting professor at the Department of Historical Studies of the University of Torino. His research focuses mainly on the hieroglyphic writings and Egyptian literature. And he's also an expert of the reception of Egypt in later times. And indeed, today's lecture is about one of the earliest pieces to enter the collection of Egyptian antiquities here in Torino, the so-called Mensa Isiaca, and the title of his lecture is Kircher's Mensa Isiaca, a monument to the Christian faith. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Maurizio, for this very gentle and dear words of introduction. Good evening, buonasera, everyone. Welcome to this lecture. I hope that, but I see that you have some translation devices, so if you can follow me straight in English, you are provided with a translation in Italian. Thank you to the museum for inviting me to give, as I understood, the first lecture of this new year. So, Kircher's Mensa Isiaca, a monument to the Christian faith. It was not a long time ago when a visitor came to the museum. One of the first objects that presented itself was the Mensa Isiaca, if you remember some time ago, a bronze table whose details are nowadays barely visible. The table, which was discovered in the first quarter of the 16th century, immediately attracted the scholarly attention as a major document to understand the mysteries of ancient Egypt. But times have changed dramatically now. One has to go to the basement to have a look at what was a major attraction at the end of the Renaissance and during the Baroque era. Father Athanasius Kircher was a living legend in the 17th century in Rome, in Italy, and abroad in Europe. But who is still acquainted with this fellow nowadays? Kircher is not, however, completely unknown in this museum. He has a prominent place on the museum timeline dealing with the deciphering of the hieroglyphs. And there is also a small case, but it's going too quickly. Yeah, of course, this one. And there is also a small case where some objects coming from the so-called Museum Kircherianum are displayed. And already in the 18th century, Kircher was mocked and quickly fell into oblivion. His native city, however, celebrated the man in 1921 by issuing 3 banknotes. Among them, one as the decipherer of the hieroglyphs, no less, and was as the inventor of the Lanterna Magica, a fact that is also reminded in the Museum of Photography here in Torino. And as you surely would agree upon now, there are some solid arguments to have a Via Kircheriana in the city. Anyway, the reality seems to be that Father Kircher and the Mensa Isiaca are now 2 ancient glories whose destinies turn out to be closely linked. So, let me first introduce the main character of our story. Athanasius Kircher was born in 602, maybe 1601, in Geisa, at the time a small town near Fulda, Germany. I inserted a view of the modern Geisa, whose center still preserved some buildings from Kircher's time. He was ordained in 1628 as a Jesuit, and because he had a well-functioning brain, which could not but favorably impress his professors, he was assigned to a teaching position in Würzburg, still in Germany. Unfortunately, so Kircher thought at the time, but hopefully for our story, Kircher was forced out of Germany in 1631 because of the turmoil of the 30 Years' War. These were terrible times indeed, as vividly shown by some engravings made by Jacques Callot 2 years later. As you can see on the screen now, two of his so-called miseries of war, the hanging and the looting of a monastery. But as we all know, the Societas Jesu was and still is a well-organized religious order. And so Kircher wasn't left without anything to do, and he was quickly assigned to a new teaching position, this time in Avignon, where he stayed for 3 years. Avignon is not very far away from Aix-en-Provence, as we know, and in this exquisite city lived an extraordinary man by all accounts. He, more than anyone else, contributed to change Kircher's life from a career of teaching in various Jesuit colleges in Europe to a prominent scholar who would eventually be granted a special status by his order, as we'll see in a moment. So Claude Fabry de Peyresque, this famous fellow, was a fellow of vast and immense knowledge with considerable financial means he used to promote science. You can see at the left of Peyresque a partial reconstruction of his library in Carpentras, France, and the so-called Ingembertina Bibliotheca. Peyresque was particularly interested in Oriental studies, sending special agents in Egypt and the Middle East to buy ancient manuscripts. He was also at the center of a vast intellectual network that covered most of Europe, as is clear from his surviving correspondence. The arrival of a new professor in Avignon hadn't gone unnoticed. Kircher was indeed preceded by the reputation of having succeeded in acquiring a valuable Arabic manuscript that would give the key for the deciphering of the hieroglyphs. This, of course, made a very strong impression on Peyresque. He became immediately acquainted with this young promising scholar, inviting him to his home. And Kircher obliged, visiting Peyresque several times, and by exchanging numerous letters. However, Peyresque, despite all his efforts, never succeeded in seeing even one line of this famous manuscript, and we'll turn to this later. Earlier in the century, in the 20s, some Coptic manuscripts had been brought to Rome. These manuscripts were of a special type called scalae. They usually have two parts, a grammatical introduction called Muqaddimat, that is the preface, and a bilingual, sometimes trilingual lexicon, Sullam in Arabic, that is the scalae stricto sensu. After some early attempts to publish the scalae, Peyresque, who was very well introduced in the Roman scholarly circles, suggested the name of Kircher to take over the edition. And so it was. In 1644 was published in Rome the Lingua Aegyptiaca Restituta. Thanks to the efforts of Peyresque, Kircher, had already by then definitely settled in Rome, where he would spend the rest of his life. The Lingua Aegyptiaca set a milestone in Egyptology at the first publication of Coptic material. Peiresc, unfortunately, never saw the publication of this book, being already dead in 1637. From his letters to Kircher, we know that he wished Kircher to keep on with Coptic and start publishing Coptic texts. But this was not at all Kircher's intention to deal with what he considered a minor scientific field. Already in the Prodromus Coptus Sive Aegyptiacus, the volume which, as the name implies, was an introduction to the Lingua Aegyptiaca, he laid the foundation of what would keep him busy for the rest of his life. Peiresc lived long enough to see the Prodromus published in 1636, and he was horrified by what he saw. For Kircher devoted a dozen of pages to matters that has nothing to do with Coptic. Kircher had actually fallen in love with ancient Egypt when he was still in Germany. According to his own testimony, he had the chance to see the famous album compiled by Hans-Georg Herwarth von Hohenburg, titled Thesaurus Hieroglyphicorum. This album, published in 1610, was a collection of most of the monuments that were supposed at this time to be Egyptian, like, very obviously, the Sphinxes or the obelisk you can see on the left part of the slide now on the screen, but also monuments that were the products of Roman Egyptomania, like the Roman canopic jars you can see on the right, and also pieces that were definitely not Egyptian. The first part of this curious album opens with a dozen plates of the Mensa Isiaca. Kircher would later remind his public that this album made a lasting impression on his mind, and that he was from then on definitely persuaded that it was his destiny to unveil the mysteries of the ancient Egyptian civilization. Before going any further, it's now time to introduce our second protagonist, the Mensa Isiaca. Its discovery is sometimes linked to the sack of Rome in 1527, but according to some scholars, this fine piece of work could well have been discovered earlier, sometime in the first 2 decades of the 16th century, probably from the excavation in the area of the ancient Iseum in Rome. Anyway, the piece was presented to Pietro Cardinal Bembo, hence its first name, Tabula Bambina. The first engraving was made by Enea Vico in 1559, before the first publication with a commentary by Laurentius Pignorius in 1605. Pignorius' explanations were simple and close to the modern analysis, a table with religious figures made for some cultic purpose. Von Herwarth had a more audacious approach, for he suggested that the table was some nautical map, as we'll see in a moment. After being carried in Venetia and Mantova, the Mensa finally landed in Torino in the end of the 17th century and entered the museum collection in 1824. The Mensa is a bronze table with inlays of different metals. It measures 1.25 meters by 75 centimeters. Now you have here a general view of the table, and as you can see, it's not very easy now to see the details of it. And so, for the sake of clarity, I immediately shift to the drawing which was available in von Herwart's album, and also because it was with that people like Kircher were dealing with this table work on a regularly and daily basis. In addition to this general view, the thesaurus offers some detailed plate, and you have here one of them. As already said, it was Herwart's opinion that the table was a nautical map. He pretended, but without explaining, that the figures were wrongly oriented. He thus provided a new table with the reverse orientation. And on this, he added next to each figure the cardinal points they were supposed to stand for. For instance, above the head of the goddess to the left of the central figure, he noted northwest, and southeast for the one to the right. Above the head of Isis in the center, he noted Isis figura in centro mundi. I suppose I don't need to translate. Actually, the decorative program is made of several panels arranged of 3 horizontal registers. And one can very easily recognize scenes that are typical of the decoration found on temple walls, especially of the late period, that is the Greco-Roman temples, like the ones in Edfu, in Dendera, in Komombo, or Esna. And this, of course, makes sense, as the Mensa was probably crafted in the 1st century AD, or somewhat later at the 2nd century AD. Let me here take a few examples. Oops, too quick, okay. Here is a well-known figure of Horus, and this is, as you can see, almost an exact copy. Pay also attention to the details on the throne or the seat of the god, of what can be found, for instance, in Dendera. On this slide, also coming from the temple of Dendera, you have a room, and when unfolded, if we can do that, when unfolded, the 3 walls offer a striking similarity with the disposition that can be observed on the Mensa. For the sake of brevity, I here collected parallels to particular scenes found on the Mensa. And starting from the upper left corner and proceeding clockwise, one will very easily recognize the Ba bird. Maybe I can, if I find the pointer. Yes, here it is. So you hear the Ba bird, and then you have here the lion with the winged sun and with the 2 uraei. Here you have a bird on the back, probably in this case the Nevis bird. Here you have another bird with a priest, probably a priest, with his hands raised before him, and in between you have an altar. If you have the goddess Sekhmet, the lion head goddess, very easily to recognize. This figure of Horus I've already alluded to, and here you have a statue of Ptah with a goddess just behind it, a Ptah in an house, just like the figure you have here. And here you have 2 geniuses performing the ritual of the Sematawi, which is the uniting of the 2 lands, the Upper and Lower Egypt. And here you have a small baboon with the moon on his head, the crescent of the moon on his head, which is a well-known possible figure for the god Thoth, as we know. And on the central panel, you have 2 goddesses, probably in this case Nephthys and Isis, but it's difficult to say, which are protecting the dead body. But there is a difference in this case because we don't have a dead body, but the two goddesses outflank, so to say, the central naos with the goddess Isis in the center, as you can see here on the slide. And of course, you also have on the Mensa, you have a lot of inscriptions. You have hieroglyphic inscriptions in columns or in lines. You can see now on the screen. But in this case, the purpose of having hieroglyphs was only to give some reminiscence of Zeus, the real ones that can be found in ancient Egypt, because these hieroglyphs are, most of the case, not real hieroglyphs, but some of them are genuine hieroglyphs, but the composition, the arrangement of them is completely meaningless. So they are kind of indexes pointing to ancient Egypt. Kircher devoted several pages to the Mensa in general, but he was not much interested in providing a general explanation of it. He rather immediately focused on a very small part of the Mensa. Actually, we are here, a very tiny portion of it, which is not even on the main surface, at a small figure that can be found on the edge, close to the lower right corner, here misrepresented by Herwarth on the left corner. If you now rush in the museum to have a look at the Mensa, I'm afraid you will be very sadly disappointed, because there is almost nothing left to see. I give you here the plate as provided by Herwarth in his album, is the top left corner, and another one can be found in the famous Recueil d'Antiquités Égyptien by the Count of Caylus, but this is 18th century. By then Kircher was already dead. And you have on the right a photograph, modern photograph, that can be found on the website of the museum. Okay? Of course, in Kircher's time, the situation was a bit different because he used the album von Herwarth, and he hasn't to go repeatedly to the Mensa for what he wanted to do with the table. And so Kircher was immediately fascinated by a small figure representing a beetle or a scarab with a human face. And I show you now the possible decomposition of this really fascinating figure. The elements we can now see on the scene can be more or less easily identified. We have three main figures: a man, the scarab, the beetle, and then a strange beast, a strange animal. We'll come to that in a moment. So we first have a man kneeling with his hands raised toward the second figure, and this is a well-known gesture of adoration. I show you a parallel on the left on the screen. The central figure is the so-called Homo scarabaeus, so the man-beetle, so to say, wearing the embedded sign of the sun and the moon of his head. And this is very important, he holds a kind of tablet in his hand, you can see here. And we'll see in a moment that this tablet will turn out to be a major piece in Kircher theory. And behind it, a seemingly dangerous animal, whose hinterpart is that of a lion, and the head that of a hound, or maybe a wolf, difficult to say. And this could well be a reminiscence of Sutekh, the famous good Sutekh, only because of the ears, but without the characteristic tail of the god. It probably not to be assimilated by the god Sutek, but more realistically, more likely in my mind, maybe the kind of monster that sometimes appear in the well-known scene of the weighing of the dead man's soul, or more correctly, heart, ready to swallow the heart of the one convicted of evil behavior in his life. At the back of the wild beast is probably, we are here, a Ujat eye. And above the oboe scarabaeus here, we have once more a winged sun disk with two uraei. And finally here, a very small column of pseudo-hieroglyphs, exactly the same kind of signs that can sometimes be found even in Egypt on some later stelae, once the knowledge of them had completely disappeared. Before proceeding any further, one should note that there is another similar group on the Mensa, but in this time on the opposite age, but it never attracted Kircher's attention for completely unknown reasons. In this case, it seems to represent a humanoid scorpion. What Kircher did with the figure of the Homo scarabaeus we'll see in detail in a moment. Let me first say a few words on what was probably the intention of the one responsible for the decorative program when it was composed, probably, as I said, in the first centuries of imperial Rome, when the cult of Isis was flourishing. Scholars, modern scholars, have taken a great interest in this small figure, which is disregarded as a mere decorative ornament in the periphery of the main figures. The motifs engraved on the main surface, as I showed you previously, are all connected to traceable iconographic elements found in genuine Egyptian material. My position is to look closely to the material to see if there is something that's close enough to what is represented on the Mensa. The scarab, as we know, was a very popular motif in ancient Egypt, mainly as a form of the solar god appearing on the horizon every morning. Well, there is some figure, but chosen at random. It can occasionally be represented with two falcon wings, largely open, and almost invariably with the sun disk between its two antennae. But this is, however, obviously not the likeliest explanation for our figure. There is another popular artifact in Egypt involving a scarab, the so-called heart scarabs. They are small objects, amulets, that have the shape of a scarab. Most of the time, the anatomic details are only very roughly suggested, as you can see on the slide now on the screen. On the opposite side, a short formula is usually written, coming from chapter 30 on the Book of the Dead. It's possible to find some parallels to our figures, parallels that sometimes bear strikingly similar features with what is represented on the Mensa. What I have in mind are figures or artifacts that would mix human features with those of the scarab. First, one can very safely beforehand exclude for our inquiry representation of the god Khepri as found, for instance, in some Ramesside royal tombs, like Ramses I, or here on the screen, the somewhat later tomb of Nefertari, the royal wife of Ramses II. But more promising is a curious object now in the Egyptisches Museum in Berlin. The details of the scarab are clearly visible, and there is a human head. This is a very large piece of work, actually, more than 40 centimeters and weighing more than 7 kilos. But actually, it shows two scarabs joined by their belly and represented in some embracing gesture. Whether this piece was connected to Ptah as demiurge, as recently suggested by Burckhardt, remains an open question and is, very fortunately for me, completely outside the scope of this lecture. So, I was at first a bit disappointed, for this kind of mixed features between human and beetle is very rare indeed. But life of an academic is sometimes full of surprises. For the clue of our little enigma might well be in this museum. There is indeed, in the collection of the museum, two scarabs that attracted my attention. Here is the first one, dated to the New Kingdom. It has a human head, and the legs are clearly visible on the side. This piece, however, lacks some important characteristic features present of the Mensa. But this nevertheless gave me some hope that humanoid scarabs were indeed part of the Egyptian repertoire, even if rarely. It's for the suspense, I just take the time to drink a bit. Okay. And the reward finally came with the piece kept, as I said, once more in this museum, under the number 5983. It's, as you can see, a small humanoid scarab. And the first time I was in the museum, I almost missed it, so, because it's very small. It's a small humanoid scarab which seems to be of the required features. It's dated to the third intermediate period, somewhat later than the first one we saw, but I must confess that I prefer to remain agnostic when dealing with the date, having no definite opinion about it, but it's really of no real importance for what we do this evening. As you can clearly see, the beetle is very well detailed, and on the opposite face is chapter 30 of the Book of the Dead, which links the piece to the set of the heart scarabs. Fine. But more interestingly, here and here, more interestingly, there is here, the scarab seems to hold something with his two in this case, well-developed antennae, which are here used as human hands. The signification of this protruding element can be guessed at when considering the opposite face. Chapter 30 of the Book of the Dead deals with the heart of the deceased, and the function of the heart scarab was to bind the heart to silence while it was being weighed in the underworld to ensure that he wouldn't be forced witness against the deceased. The stylized shape of the heart is clearly visible on two Ib amulets, Ib being the word for heart in Egyptian, now on the screen, on the left part on the screen. And on the Turin scarab, the upper part of the reverse side, here, perfectly matches the shape of the heart. We can now come back to Kircher, who had, of course, not the slightest idea of what a heart scarab could be. Of course, as the Mensa only displays the obverse of the scarab, it was impossible to know that something could be written on the other side. So that two completely different stories, the origin, the likeliest origin for this little motif on the Mensa, and now we turn on to what Kircher would do with this. That's completely different. On the Mensa, now, on the Mensa, the engraver gave some autonomy to this part of the heart, which just became a tablet with apparently some letters written in it. And the table kept, however, some trace of its origin by exhibiting a curious, apparently meaningless outgrow, a kind of protruding element at the front, which is probably to be connected with this small part of the scarab in the collection of the museum. For Kircher, this tablet, held by the Homo scarabaeus, happened to be of the utmost importance. Also, the reading is by no means easy. Kircher didn't hesitate to recognize 4 letters. Here, the first one, top left, a phi. That's the most critical part of his reasoning, and then a epsilon, and on the lower register, on the left, a lambda, and then a omicron. And immediately interpreted this as meaning philo. This word, philo, is assigned to a Coptic word meaning to love, which he believed was later borrowed by the Greek and was at the origin of a set of, words connected to the idea of love. In his commentary in the Prodromus, Kircher refers the reader to the Scala to be published in his Lingua Restituta 8 years later. And the word indeed appears on the manuscript, on the Scala composed by Abu Ishaq ibn al-Hassal, and I show you the relevant page of Kircher's publication, here on the left on the screen. And here I show you the manuscript. It's not exactly the manuscript used by Kircher. It's a manuscript now in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, Coptic manuscript 46. It's another copy, but exactly of the same text. And you hear an enlargement. It's this part at the bottom on the right column, and you can very easily read for yourself the word philo with the gloss in Arabic, muhabbit. Okay. Useless to say, there is no such word as philo in Coptic. And by paying a closer attention to his own publication, Kircher would have quickly realized that the generic word meaning to love in Coptic and some derived words is me or mai, derived from ancient Egyptian Mary. A lot of words were indeed borrowed in Coptic from the Greek, but not the other way around. And the Coptic lexicon has indeed some compound words beginning with philo, always written with an iota instead of an epsilon. So I have no idea where Abu Ishaq ibn al-Hassal, a Coptic scholar who lived in the 13th century, picked up this philo for his Scala. But the fact that he mainly collected his data from religious texts, where Greek loanwords abound, might guide us to a likely explanation. The Scala of Abu Ishaq is also particular, as the words are ordered according to the final letter, as you can see here on the manuscript kept in Paris. Anyway, Kircher never wondered why Coptic or Greek letters would suddenly pop up on an artifact which is covered by hieroglyphs, or more correctly by fake ones, and why those letters on the edge, so in the almost invisible part of the table, would convey the most important teaching of the Mensa. As is evident, when dealing with the Coptic scalae in the mid-30s, Kircher was already obsessed by the so-called ancient Egyptian mysteries. To understand how he proceeded, one should better keep in mind that he was and remained a theologian throughout his life. A theologian whose obsession was to show that all nations, even as far away as China, and he wished in his early years to be sent abroad to China as a missionary. And so all these nations, and even the peoples living in America, all these nations were connected in his mind to this unique Urzeit. The Egyptian will call it the Zeptepi, the first time when Adam had been given the knowledge of everything by God. And after the fall of the Babel Tower, and by the way, at the title of another Kircher's book, nations were scattered all over the world, but they all retain, and sometimes even without being aware of it, fragments of the faith. And this was, of course, a very astute trick to maintain the unity proclaimed in the sacred book. Under the name of Prisca Theologia, the Christian faith was so never interrupted, even if it sometimes survived under the radar, so to say, in some concealed way. When discussing the case of Egypt in particular, elaborating about what he could find in the ancient classical authors, and refining insights made by some humanists, like very prominently Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola, it was Kircher's conviction that the Egyptian priest had invented the hieroglyphs for recording in a cryptic way the most sacred wisdom, and that the obelisk had been created especially to that purpose for supporting this text. He would explain his method and his result in his two major publications, which must be considered as two complementary works: Obeliscus Pamphilius and Oedipus Aegyptiacus. To recover the mysteries of the ancient religion, Kircher's method was entirely symbolic. And to achieve his goal, he has to reconstruct as systematically as possible the Encyclopedia of Ancient Egypt. This explains why Kircher devoted hundreds of pages to all the aspects of this ancient culture. Here is an example of his method. It's taken from his last work titled Sphinx Mystagoga. And the very common formula for introducing the word of a god, in this case Osiris, was understood by Kircher as meaning vita rerum domito tifone velociter in humido nature vigilantia Osiridis conservatibur ope praesidentis Anubis ides Mercurii praevis sacrificis. Kircher's translations rarely offer a transparent meaning. Transposed in English, this approximately gives the life of things, Tifo being submitted, will be quickly preserved in the humid principle of nature under the guard of Osiris, with the office of Anubis, Ides Mercurius, presiding with the former sacrifices. As already said, each sign was invested with a symbolic meaning. Here is what is stated, for instance, for the cobra, the first hieroglyph. The serpent on all the obelisks is a symbol of life. According to Horapollo, the reason is that it is a very quick animal. Moreover, even if cut into pieces, some of them, by still moving, make the proof that there is still life within. And you have the Latin original text above. Kircher's understanding of what is an hieroglyph might be grasped from this statement, and this from his book published in 1666, Die Obelisci. You have the front page on the right. Hieroglyphic, from Greek hieros and glyptein, which means sacred engraving, is nothing else than the symbol of a sacred thing, which has been carved on extremely resistant stones and rocks against all kinds of corruption. For the Egyptians used to compose and create their symbols not with a discourse or some verbal or nominal construction, but with these marks and figures which incorporate the total and exact meaning of what was the higher mysteries of the nature and of the divinity. By an ingenious method, they adapted the meanings by using an obscure and allegorical veil of images which was as far away as possible of the awareness of the profanes and uneducated ones. Okay. He also applied exactly the same mode of reasoning to iconography. Figures were also hieroglyphs which could be deconstructed into meaningful elements. And here is how one of the gods depicted on the Mensa Isiaca is analyzed by decomposing the relevant element. You can see for yourself how he analyzes the different elements, the dress, the seed, the crowns, and the scepter of the god. With this in mind, we can now return to the Homo scarabaeus. When decomposing a complex figure into its constitutive components, Kircher actually does exactly what we still do. Egyptologists and more broadly historians of art of religion also tried to understand the meaning and the purpose of a scepter, of a crown, of a dress, or the form of a seat. But the difference is less in the type of analysis itself than in the fact that Kircher worked with some deeply anchored and perceived convictions because of his own agenda. He wanted to prove something. Moreover, as already said, he didn't master the basic notions of modern epistemology. For him, a very vague similitude between two otherwise unconnected objects or features was sufficient to link them. Working with elusive analogies, he was completely immune to new methods of scientific reasoning that were emerging in his time, as witnessed by a new school of scholars like Descartes, Newton, and later Leibniz. So he regularly misunderstood the identification of the iconographic elements he was dealing with, and with the same regularity, he picked up the most unreliable explanation to make them fit into his general semiotic system. And so here is how he analyzed the elements of the Homo scarabaeus by considering three viewpoints: etymological, symbolical, and theological. The winged sun disk, to start with, he interpreted as the soul of the world. The scarabaeus, identified as Osiris, as the universal motor of the world. The circles at the orbit of the skies, the head at the sun, the crescent at the top of the head at the moon, and the crux he saw inside the crescent at the superior elements. To be fair, this identification were more or less supported by what you could find in the ancient, mainly Greek authors. Turning then to the 4 letters he identified on the tablet, remember the word philo, for love, he considered it the all-governing principle of everything on earth and in the cosmos. So, the figure, the right, candidly titled Systema Mundi Juxta Mente Veterum Aegyptiorum, that is, the system of the world according to the ancient Egyptians, attributes to the components of the Homo scarabaeus a distinctive place in the cosmos, with at the 4 angles the letters phi, epsilon, lambda, and omicron as a reminder of the driving force of the universe. Kircher has, of course, a symbolic explanation for the 4 letters. We have already seen what he made of the phi, or supposed phi, that's for philo, you remember, for love. The 2nd and 3rd letters he considered together. The first one, the epsilon, has, according to him, the shape of a reversed pyramid, and the 2nd one, the lambda, the shape of a standing pyramid. The last one, the omicron, Kircher easily interpreted as a globe. And these 3 signs were supposedly symbolizing the ascending and descending movement of love, itself symbolized by the letter phi. To make it clearer, the figure now on the screen illustrates the complementary movement of love. I hope you still follow. With such an important revelation, actually the most important about the essence of the theology of the ancient Egypt, had apparently been transmitted by the way of a small figure, 3 centimeters wide, on the outer edge of the Mensa in a most insignificant place. Why? Never Kircher discussed this point, obviously. Its general interpretation of the scarabaeus was, of course, partly supported by what the ancient authors had written about it. He could, for instance, find some useful information in Pseudo-Horapollos' Hieroglyphica. Another source, which is never commented by modern scholars, came from a Christian theologian and came to Kircher through Valeriano in his Hieroglyphica. In a section titled Deus in humano corpore, so God in a human body, Valeriano states that the Egyptians represented the supreme God with the body of a beetle. But to immediately avoid criticism that God could never have been represented as an abject animal, Valeriano cites Augustine, who discussed the matter in his Soliloquies. But actually, I failed to see a trace of such a statement by Augustine, but Ambrosius, in his comment on Luke, did actually wrote that Jesus Christ is also called the good Scarabaeus, who had modeled the informed clay of our bodies. Whether Ambrosius was influenced here by some Egyptian tradition remains a point for discussion. In one of his commentaries, Jerome discreetly rejected Ambrosius' interpretation as a wrong reading of the original text. But for Kircher, however, Valeriano's comment, which he didn't bother to check out, was perfect, as it allowed him to make the necessary bridge between the symbolic representation favored by the ancient Egyptian priest and the Christian faith. This point was thus of utmost importance in his work, as it validated the principle of the Prisca Theologia, that is, the uninterrupted transmission of the divine revelation. But our story doesn't end here. The figure of the Mensa Scarabaeus Sacer is curiously found in an Arabic treatise and some ancient secret writings. After reviewing some secret alphabet, the author, Ibn Washiyah, or more likely a pseudo Ibn Washiyah, gives under the name Hermesian alphabet, after the name of Hermes Trismegistus, some genuine or almost genuine hieroglyphs which he unfortunately misinterprets. Under the name of Ibn Washiyah has been transmitted a book with the title The Book of the Desire of the Maddened Lover for the Knowledge of Secret Script, the famous Kitab Shawak Mustaham fi Ma'rifat Rumus al-Aqlam, probably composed in the 11th century, if not a bit later, and Ibn Washiyah lived in the 9th century. As you can see now from the slide on the screen, there are a few recognizable hieroglyphic signs with, beginning from the left, the supposed phonetic equivalent. Here you have Arabic letters. Here in the central part you have once again some hieroglyphs. It's possible to recognize some of them, and this time you are not provided with a phonetic equivalent, but with a translation or rather a gloss. And here on the right side you have a small phrase, actually a real one, very easily to interpret, Hamnecher Imen, that is the priest, a priest of Amun, but which is given by the author of this treaty a totally different explanation. Okay. This text has come down to us in at least 4 manuscripts. You can see the following figure now on the screen. I here show you the figure which is on the manuscript, once more with the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, an Arabic manuscript because it's the better copy we have. The similarities between the two figures are striking indeed, but there are differences as well. And I here only point to some of them. To begin with, the crown, which is different, the concentric circles you have here, which are completely absent from the Homo scarabaeus, and of course you have here a winch figure. So we can wonder, maybe this is not because of the winch sun disk here, and because it's missing the figure in the Arabic manuscript, that maybe it could be a kind of fusion of the two elements, but as we'll see in a moment, this is not the most likely explanation. But the most convincing point of convergence is, of course, the tablet held by the human scarab. So here, the famous tablet, but with some small differences. The letters have been preserved, okay? The tablet has been given larger proportions in the Arabic manuscript, and if one looks attentively, one can also note that the sequence of signs is not exactly the same. And finally, here, the copyist or the drawer in the Arabic manuscript decidedly opted for a letter that is closer to a psi than a phi. And Finally, the protruding element here is no longer oriented to the exterior, to the front, but this is the device by which the Homo scarabaeus holds the tablet very firmly. This figure came with a text, and you hear the translation. It is expressive of the most sublime secret called originally Bahumet and Karuj, or Calf. That is the secret of the nature of the world, the secret of secrets, the beginning and return of everything. To speak at length of this figure is more than the limit of this book alone, and it's a pity, really. We refer the curious who wish for more explanation to a book which we have translated from our Nabatean language into Arabic, entitled Sun of Suns and Moon of Moons, illuminating the discovery of the Hermesian alphabet or hieroglyphics, where it will be completely satisfied. As is evident, the figure on the Arabic manuscript shares many features with that of the Mensa, but is not completely dependent on it. Indeed, this figure has also some links with some genuine Arabic iconography. A close parallel, indeed, in the Persian tradition are figures representing the role of angels and the functioning of the universe. And I give you now a representation of this. This is, on the right, a wonderful figure representing the role of the angels in the functioning of the cosmos. This comes from a 16th century manuscript, now in Cambridge, that preserves some beliefs of the Haranim Sabians, an astral cult who preserved ancient practices of Mesopotamians. And they believed that all events in the terrestrial realm were produced by the configuration of the planets, and that each planet and celestial sphere was animated by Ruahinat, that is the celestial spirits or souls. And the power of the spirits could be harnessed to impact change in the sublunary realm, that is here, through rituals. In the heavens, the angel Israfil, here represented, holds a sacred figure, a mandala-like representation of planetary spheres that, when drawn in its likeness on Earth, causes an awakening in the spirit world. And this creates, and this is the most important thing, this creates a gateway between worlds, and through it, the angels may ascend and descend. One can see very easily the connections that can be made between how Kirche interpreted the Philo sign and the beliefs held by the Sabians. More specifically, I'd like to raise your attention to what Kirche said about the letters lambda and epsilon. He interpreted, you remember, as the symbols of moving up and down, which is reminiscent of the rules on the angels in the Sabian tradition. It's not time to conclude, even if the conclusion must for now remain largely open. When coming to Avignon in 1631, Kirche was supposed to be in possession of an Arabic manuscript, remember this, that would give the key to the deciphering of the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Despite many attempts by Peresque and others to have a copy, or very simply a look at it, Kirche never showed it. So, two hypotheses offer themselves. The simplest one is that the manuscript never existed. That's a possibility, of course, but it left unanswered many questions.
The second one is thus perhaps more interesting. So let's pose it, just for the sake of argument, let's pose it that Kircher has or was able to see such a manuscript. Why did he refuse to show it to Peiresc, who always did all that he could do to promote Kircher's career and Kircher's interest? A possible explanation is that Kircher had by then realized that the manuscript was not as promising as firstly claimed. One could thus make the hypothesis that the manuscript was the prototype of the 4 existing copies of the Pseudo-Ibn Washiyah Treaty on the Secret Writings. Note that the enigmatic figure has a prominent place of the Paris manuscript, of the Paris copy, figuring alone on a new page. It also marks a rupture with what precedes. One has the feeling that it could be a later adjunct made by some copyist. And now comes the big question. How one can reasonably explain how a copyist of an Arabic manuscript managed to see a drawing of the Mensa, and the first one dates to 1559, and then make a composite figure mixing elements of the Sabian tradition with the Scarabaeus Sacer of the Mensa. The time frame, as you can see on the screen, is indeed very narrow, very narrow. To sort this out, the solution must be looked at into the Arabic tradition. One can only hope that a still unpublished manuscript will one day turn out to give us the missing link. And this is far from being a mere wish, as there are still so many manuscripts waiting to be published. If Kircher was able to see such a manuscript, and I'm very much tempted to think so, it undoubtedly gave him the fuel he needed to push his ideas forward. And now the last question. Shouldn't we rather consider the direction of the mutual influence the other way around? Could the Arab copyist in charge of the prototype of the 4 surviving manuscripts have taken notice of the books of Kircher and consequently take his interpretation for drawing the figure of the winch Homo scarabaeus? In my opinion, this is very unlikely, for this would leave us with no compelling reason for Kircher to raise this small figure to such an emblematic status in his theory. As already suggested, he needed a major impulse to do so. The reluctance he showed in concealing from Peiresc the famous Arabic manuscript he was supposed to come with could therefore find its explanation. As we know, Kircher was not very open as regards his sources. He also many times used text without citing them. In this particular case, he had perhaps to be even more cautious, as one of his main theories was grounded in a non-Christian text, which was potentially dangerous at these times. And finally, as already said, by the time he was in Avignon, he also might have realized that the text of the Pseudo-Ibn Washiyah was not very helpful for the deciphering of the hieroglyphs. And with this two still unanswered questions, I thank you for your attention.
Wow. Thank you very much for this insightful lecture. And to use an Italian expression, there is tanta carne al fuoco. There is very much to talk about. It's as for the Mensa Isiaca, I could summarize fake, but not so fake, because there is. It amazed me the kind of knowledge that they had to draw, to reproduce some images, and specifically some rare, not very common images, and but on the other hand, completely fake or almost fake hieroglyphs. So they didn't have this sort of knowledge.
But yeah, just to give a small piece of comment onto this, in Rome, particularly because the Mensa was, of course, crafted for the Isiac cult in Rome, there were the times people who were very closely connected to Egypt, and more precisely Egyptian priests, the so-called hierogrammates. And for instance, we know that a fellow like Cairo Raymond, if you prefer, was an Egyptian priest living in Rome. He was also, just for a moment, he was a preceptor to the future Emperor Nero. So we had first century AD, and he wrote a treaty which is probably the source for what has come down to us as Horapollos Hieroglyphica. So he drew mainly a list of hieroglyphs with a meaning. So there was knowledge, of course, of genuine Egyptian materials in Rome. They had imported some objects, real objects, like obelisks, the most famous one. I also remind you that the famous Pamphilius obeliscus, and Kircher devoted a book on this. This obeliscus was erected in Piazza Agonale in Rome, now Piazza Navona, and this obelisk has inscription on it, and this inscription were composed in Rome in the first century AD. So there was people who had still some knowledge of hieroglyphs, but also there were kind of Egyptomania in Egypt, in Rome, and for instance in the famous villa of Tivoli, we are now in the 2nd century AD with Emperor Adrian. They had some pieces designed and done in Rome or in Italy, which were only reminiscent of some Egyptian material. I saw you the famous canopic jar, and the iconography we can find on this, nothing to do with the real jars, but they are referring quite honestly to some iconography found on the coffins, on the late period coffins. So there is a mix. There are some people who definitely knew something. Also in the Asinus by Apuleius, at some point he showed a procession by the priests coming out of the temples, and at one point he said there was a priest carrying some manuscripts, and he describes the aspect of this manuscript. He's probably alluding to hieratic script at this time. So no, there was still some knowledge in Rome. So it's not absolutely improbable that there was some knowledge, sufficient knowledge to have a piece like this one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Are there any questions? I saw some students of Egyptology there, so who can probably pose some questions.
Even this is not Egyptology, strictly speaking, but Egypt is everywhere. So no, it's what's fascinating with Kircher that he started with the publication of this Coptic material, and he did more or less well. Actually, he was he was dependent and he didn't recognize this, but by a previous work done by Obicini, but that's another story. But he wasn't interested in this. He could have given the first edition of Coptic text. For instance, there were in Italy at this time some manuscripts with the Bible, for instance. But the first edition of the Coptic Bible text had to wait the next century. That was a pity. But, okay, he was the first to do this, and it was a milestone for Egyptology. But for the work on hieroglyphs, he just made us back from 1 century, because after Kirchhoff's death, one has to deconstruct what has done, and it took maybe half century to do so, and then the future Egyptologists, not already Egyptologists, but they were able to start on fresh and new basis only by the mid-18th century, with the publication of new materials, genuine materials, in the catalogue by Montfaucon and by Count of Caylus, as I saw you just a picture of this previously. And with this, it was possible to move forward, but very, very gradually. And they had to realize that Coptic was probably the last phase of Egyptian, and that by studying Coptic, it would probably give us some very useful keys and clues to decipher the hieroglyph, but it was very painstakingly done until the expedition by Bonaparte in Egypt and the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. But you know the story, of course, of this. But between Kircher, the most important book, Oedipus Aegyptiacus and Obeliscus Pamphilus, it's right in the middle of the 17th century. It's 1650, 1655 for the last volume of the Aegyptus, and the discovery by Champollion is, as you know, 1822. Donc there is not exactly 2 centuries, but almost two centuries. But it's a big gap, actually.
Any question?
Don't be afraid.
Yeah, so thank you. I was fascinated by the scarab, the comparison between Kircher's scarab, the scarab on the Mensa Isiaca, and the scarabs in the Museo Egizio in Turin, and how whoever designed the Mensa Isiaca and then entrusted its realization to a master metallurgist, somebody who could do incredible inlays with alloys, incredibly complex work, but then somebody did, maybe the person who designed it wasn't the metal worker. There were two different distinct people, but there was someone who, as you showed, had a deep knowledge, well, or at least a broad knowledge, if not a deep one, a broad knowledge of Egyptian iconography and the scenes on temples. And I'm what always strikes me about the Mensa is its combination of knowledge of actual Egyptian scenery and imagery, and it's the use of this imagery to say something, to put it into Hellenistic, Greco-Roman mold. So, for example, I think if I remember correctly, what Philippe Dershan wrote about it is that the whole composition is symmetrical. So it's got this symmetry, the north and south, east and west, and the gods are correctly arranged according to their geographical location, which is, Dershan argued, un-Egyptian. It's not the way an Egyptian thinks. It's this kind of thing brings a different vision. So it's fascinating to wonder who this figure who had a foot in Egyptian culture, but on the other foot much more firmly in Greco-Roman culture, who such a figure could have been. I mean, it's a tantalizing object if ever there was one.
Yeah, but no comment to this, I can only agree. I was not much interested myself in the real purpose of the Mensa because it was not my topic. I'm only interested here in what Kierkegaard did with that. And for Kierkegaard, it doesn't matter, of course, if this was the correct orientation or the other way around. But it's true that when you look at the, I try to show this very quickly. If you take at the main reference the iconography of the temples of the Greco-Roman time, there are some parallels to be done. And what's especially striking is if you take, you remember the room I showed from Dendera, you have 3 walls, and if you unfold it, that can give you some general idea of where the church responsible for conceiving the Mensa took the inspiration from. So yeah, it's as you say, a broad knowledge, but not a deep knowledge, and that's especially true of the hieroglyphs. It was impossible for them to have such a composition without adding hieroglyphs, of course, and so they put some. And they are midway, because as I said, most of the time they are real hieroglyphs, so if you look at them individually, you can point to some real hieroglyphs, but the composition, it's meaningless. So, but it's better that what we could find later, even in Egypt, when sometimes the hieroglyphs were reduced to some stroke, and even on stela. So you can have, and in this case, you can have for the iconography something that it's still reasonably Egyptian, but with an inscription which is a very vague reminiscence of Egyptian inscription. So the knowledge, it's only to be expected, the knowledge of the ancient script, because hieroglyph was not the script used for the everyday life, it was demotic at the time, and the language, Egyptian de traditional Egyptian, which was, of course, the language used, it's obviously what's gone the quickest out of the Egyptian mind. So they preserve some kind of imagery for the language and the script. There was nobody still able to manage this very correctly.
Other question? It's interesting how Kircher approach to hieroglyphs sometimes reminds the modern approach to these fields by completists, by people who don't know anything about ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia or ancient civilization, who believe in many fake news or things like that. And trying to make a comparison with my field, which is Assyriology, his approach to ancient Egyptian writing reminds me also the approach of Babylonian scribes to cuneiform writing, when they deconstruct cuneiform signs and develop and expand the meanings of the signs to create new meanings, probably completely detached from the original meaning of a specific cuneiform sign. And I was wondering whether in Egypt we have a similar approach of Egyptian scribes to their own writing, to their hieroglyphic writing.
That's interesting. So this link that can be made between script and secret, it's already what's to be found in the small citation from Kircher I show you in my lecture. It's at the end. By an ingenious method, we are here, they adapted the meanings by using an obscure, so a willingly obscure, that's what it meant, an obscure and allegorical veil of images which was as far away as possible of the awareness of the profane and unindicated ones. That is very what Kircher view the role of hieroglyphs. Hieroglyphs had been invented by priests to, of course, record the principles, Prisca Theologia, of the faith, but also to have them concealed from the layman, which is very curious in a way, because one could wonder why everybody couldn't have access to the revelation by God. And this point was criticized by the Protestants at the time. So the Protestants were not very happy with that, because as you know, one of the motives for the Protestant revolution was, for instance, to translate the Bible in the vernacular languages, to give access to the people, of course, of having no longer a frontier or a wall between knowledge and the people. And with this, Kircher did exactly this. And this is completely in touch with what the ancient author says. So if the Greek and the Latin, if you look at this, how they presented the hieroglyphs, so authors like Herodotus, Diodorus, Plutarchus, and of course the Neoplatonists, that's the top of it, prominently Philo, they said that the hieroglyphs were, so to say, the best means to communicate with the gods, because they were no longer the filter of language. Language, for them, is a distorting way to express ideas, and with an image, it was possible to communicate directly with the God. But the image didn't reveal the reality of the truth immediately. They had this kind of symbolic veil, as Kircher put it, and so it was possible, and this was a dream made by Leibniz, for instance, that this kind of writing system could be a kind of universal writing, because it would be possible, and so said Diodorus, he said, without knowing Egyptian, because hieroglyphs have nothing to do with the language, it was possible to understand everything in his own language, provided that we know the symbolic meaning of this. And Leibniz, who was working on the possibility of having a universal language or a universal writing system, was attracted, but for a very short time, by ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. And he wondered if this could be maybe a kind of universal writing, and he exchanged letters with Kircher for a while, and then, but after a while he decided that Kircher was too crazy and he didn't want to deal with him. And this idea of the universal writing or universal language came again in the 18th century with Chinese. And so Chinese was also supposed to be a kind of writing system that could give access immediately without filters to the ID. And so you see the connection to the ID. It's a Platonic view, of course. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but in the mid-18th century, there was a trend among some scholars who wanted to see a link between hieroglyphs, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and the Chinese sign. The Chinese, which, by the way, at that time were also called hieroglyphs. And so there was a chap in Paris, in the institute, in charge in the Chinese teaching, named Joseph de Guignes, and who wrote a small treatise titled Où il est prouvé, where it's proved, que la Chine, China, is a colony of the ancient Egyptians. So he went so far as to suggest that there was not some parallels to be made between Chinese and Egyptian, but that China was a colony of ancient Egypt. And why? felt entitled to say so because some authors like Diodorus and Herodotus reported that the famous king Sesostris, but it's a mixed figure at the time, went with a big army, 600,000 guys. You can imagine 600,000 people. And he went as far away as India to conquer India, invade India. Well, when you're in India, you're not very far away from China, but it was possible to go to China. And so went the story. And this very curious idea had once again to be deconstructed before coming to reason once again. Don't you see this fancy and once again is to save the unity of human civilization, because by saying that China could be linked to ancient Egypt, and ancient Egypt could be linked to the Greek Roman world, and through this you can have it the link with the big alpha, with Adam, and you save the Pristina Theologia. So it was fantastic, and Kircher wrote a book. It was a bestseller in his time, the China Illustrata, and he suggested in a small paragraph this possibility that the Chinese writing system could have been founded by the Egyptians, and so he suggested the link. And you have here in Turin, Turin is a fantastic city for that, in the Palazzo Reale, you have the famous Isis bust.
City of Magic.
It's a bust like that, and he has some sign on the bust, and they were supposed at the time to be Chinese character. And so there was a big polemic in the 18th century, mid-18th century, because this bust, which was supposed to be an Egyptian goddess with Chinese characters on it, so that was perfect, that proved everything, of course. But as we know, it's a modern artifact, probably made in the 18th century, and for the signs or the characters or whatever that are on the bust, they're probably to be connected with some astrological or some magic sign, but it has nothing to do with China. But at the time, some so-called experts of Chinese writing in Europe sworn that they were Chinese, and they went so far as writing to Jesuit father in China, because you know there was a very important mission of Jesuits in China, and asking them to look in the big dictionaries and if you can find some parallels. And the Jesuits themselves said, "Oh, we are very deeply sorry, but it has nothing to do with China." So, and this bust, yeah, it's in the Palazzo Reale, but you have a 3D copy here in the museum, just in the basement, close to or in front actually, of the Mensa Isiaca. So definitely you should have, I would suggest this to the mayor, you should have a Via Kircheriana in Torino, maybe not a Corso, but a small street maybe.
Somewhere.
A one-way street would be perfect for
One way.
a one-way street.
I have other questions, but I will keep them for dinner.
Okay. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much.
I very much hope you enjoy it.